This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Peter Mousaferiadas is a composer, conductor, producer, award-winning leader, and executive director of Cultural Infusion, an Australian organization committed to building cultural harmony and well-being through a range of sustainable arts and engagement programs for schools, youth, and communities. Cultural Infusion's programs use intercultural contact to catalyze positive change to a broad audience. For example, Cultural Infusion's education program, Discovering Diversity, is delivered to more than 200,000 students annually. I spoke with Peter in Melbourne. Hello, Peter. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Hello, Stephen from Melbourne, Australia. Can't tell you how excited I'm to be on your show this morning.
Melbourne, Australia, and I'm calling you from Costa Rica, so we are literally on opposite sides of the planet. I hope that yours is as beautiful as mine. Fantastic. Peter, you work or direct an organization called Cultural Infusion. Can we start off by having you tell us about the genesis of Cultural Infusion and sort of what's its focus, what it does?
Do you want the 3-minute version or do you want the 30-minute version? Which one are you after there, Stephen?
Let's go for the 5-minute version.
Okay, for the 5-minute version. Okay, so really quickly, I initially trained as a symphonic conductor in the Czech Republic, Italy, and America. Before that, I studied, music performance at the Victorian College of the Arts in Melbourne, Australia. Went overseas, studied in the Czech Republic, Italy, America. Came back to Australia. I started working with a whole lot of community groups. But all along throughout this journey, I felt like my own heritage was being denied. I felt like I have a heritage, a Greek heritage. Why isn't there a voice in the community there to hear what the Greek community has got to offer, to hear what the Chinese community has got to offer, to hear what all the other communities have got to offer? And I suppose it was at that point where I started to formulate these ideas around forming an organisation which would not only conserve intangible culture, but find ways to revitalise it through an intercultural setting. So I came back, I started working with choirs, and what I began to find was that people were beginning to, request my organisational skills and started to ask me if I could start putting on productions around, events that would start to showcase artists from many different backgrounds. And that started to become like a window to this whole world of, so many communities that made up Australia's multicultural community. So back in 2000, or actually before 98, I was having coffee with my partner and I said to her, look, I've got this idea, to form this organisation which is, about promoting cultural diversity, in youth, in communities, in education, and using the arts as the primary driver for that. So she said, look, go off and get me a cup of tea and leave the tea bag in there. Don't forget to put 2 teaspoons of sugar in there. So I came back with the cup of tea and the tea bag, and I went to say something, and she goes, just shut up, let me think for a moment. And as she's dunking her tea bag, she goes, that's what you've been doing for as long as I've known you. You infuse people with culture. You're infusing people with culture, cultural infusion. And that's how the name came about. But it took about another 5 years before we were actually able to go out there in the marketplace. It was market research, forming focus groups, developing databases, developing a business case to be able to go, okay, we want to develop an organisation that's, going to be able to offer some value to the community and some sustainability. And 2015, 12 years later, we're now operating in 6 different countries across the world.
Fantastic introduction. I want to jump off into the business case that you created because it's so rare, unfortunately, to hear of someone who really sat down and said, look, let's research this. Let's come up with our focus. Let's let's make that business case. Can you walk us through that a little bit more in detail about what were the exact tools that you used? How did you discard ideas? How did you find ones that worked?
Something I'm very open about, Stephen, is that the organisational structure that underpins this organisation. The way I describe it to many people out there is that we have a hybrid social entrepreneurial model which underpins this organisation, which is basically a mix of profit and non-profit organisations coming together to build human capacity. If you ask me to try to define a social enterprise, it's very difficult to define social enterprises, to try to stovepipe them by definition. What we can say is that they take many, many different shapes, but they all have a common objective to give back to the community, to build capacity in the environment, in society, whether it be a local or a global level. Now, in terms of how this structure actually came about, there were so many things I wanted to initially do within a profit framework, and it wasn't viable. And I found there was a lot of criticism out there.
Can you give me maybe one or two examples of what the things that weren't viable? Yeah, of course.
We wanted to begin to access remote communities, to take our programs to remote communities. In Australia, the distances are so huge, it just wasn't viable. We needed support. We needed funds to access those communities. We needed funds for professional development for a lot of our cultural presenters. These programs, to develop capacity in those areas, it's impossible if you don't have actually some support. Now, when I started to go out there with Cultural Infusion, I always found that there was almost this sort of dichotomy of these two worlds working against each other. The not-for-profit world, the social, the mission-driven world, and the profit-making world out there. And they would be working against each other. And people would often throw comments against me and say, "Oh, you're just a profit-making entity." But I wasn't. I was wanting to give back to the community. And I was having these discussions with a myriad of people out there, and I began to notice that I wasn't the only one out there. But what I had to do was I had to go through this arduous task of beginning to set up this not-for-profit initiative which would allow us to access public funds for programs which weren't viable within a profit framework. And that happened in about 2005 and 2006. And we've been very, very open about this hybrid structure. But people are now beginning to warm to the idea. People are now beginning to warm to the idea of social enterprises. We've seen in the state of Minnesota, I think it was in 2006, 2007, they've developed a social responsible corporation, which allows now profit-making organisations to access public funds, providing they can show how they're giving back to the community. And I see this new emerging economy, this new fourth sector, and the fourth sector being defined by a myriad of all these different types of social enterprises now really beginning to take shape, where governments need to recognise them and say, you know what, maybe it's time for us to develop a new organisational sector, a sector which goes beyond the government sector, the not-for-profit sector, the profit sector, and maybe a sector which begins to unlock the trapped energy that you might find within each of these pure constructs, to create something exciting, something new, and something which is more efficient. Because in the end, what we're talking about is that if I can go out there and create $1 million program on 25% public funds, when someone else out there might need 70 or 80% public funds, then that means there's funds left over that can go back out there into the community. I mean, that's a pretty huge saving we're talking about.
Sure, absolutely. And as you scale it, it's the savings just get greater.
Yeah, of course they do. Absolutely. And you know what the hybrid social enterprises actually do is they really do take the best of all the different sectors. You begin to develop efficiencies because of cross-sector partnerships. You begin to have boundary spanners, people that can work across both the different entities. And then you can really start to move forward and not get bogged down with a lot of the compliance and administration that you can often find with not-for-profit organisations.
One question I think would be hanging out there for some of those stalwarts in the not-for-profit community would be, how do you prevent the Coca-Colas of the world and the Pfizers of the world and you name your big corporation from calling themselves a hybrid or stepping into that territory? Or is that a problem in your mind?
Well, the thing is, a lot of these big conglomerates have already got their foundations that they've set up on the side. There's the CocaCola Foundation, which has already been established. There's the Pfizer out there, which has already got its own foundations, which is already giving back to the community. So in one way, they're already doing that. But what I think we need to do is, the moment that you start to work in this space, it starts to get you thinking about how your organisation is not just profit-driven, but is also mission-driven. So you start to blur the boundaries to some extent, but that's where the excitement, I think, is as well. Where you begin to get this excitement, this almost this effervescent activity which would be a good word for Coca-Cola to use, where you can start to really start to drive programs out there which are going to give back to the community, because you're not only thinking about the bottom line all the time and how we're going to be pleasing the shareholder. Because in the end, what the hybrid's doing is it's forcing you to give back as an individual. And that's what I found with myself. It forces me to give back.
You sort of made a great pivot there in the conversation, or an opening in the conversation, to come back and talk about some of the work Cultural Infusion does. Tell me about either a program you're doing right now or something that you've done in the past where you sort of started out with one idea and you said, hey, let's see what we can do here. And you were just sort of blown away by a completely surprising result, or something different happened that you didn't expect.
One of the things I always say to my staff is, today, the only sustainability is adaptability. They say that in the next 10 years, there are going to be more changes than what humanity's experienced over the last 10,000 years. So what we try to do is constantly do a scan of our environment, throw the net out there and go, okay, what is the marketplace actually wanting now? How is the marketplace thinking? And to some extent, that actually starts to drive our programs. But I might go back even a little bit further, all the way back to 1988 when I started to sort of work in this space. My father said to me recently, he goes, what is it that you do? I have no idea what you do. One day you're conducting orchestras, the next day you're writing a mass, for an orchestra and choir and a didgeridoo. The next day you're directing a huge show for, an opening ceremony for a UN event or, a global interfaith event. I don't exactly understand what you do. You run programs for schools. You're running all sorts of events. You're developing workshops, working with disengaged youth. I don't understand what is it that you do. And what I've realised over the last 27 years since 1988, is that there's always been a common thread. It's always been about bringing people together to build understanding, to build intercultural understanding as a core value and as a key competency of global citizenship. So if I was to sum it up in a tagline, what do we do? What does Cultural Infusion do? We build global harmony through intercultural action. That's probably the simplest way to do it. We have a fantastic education program. We deliver to 300,000 students annually throughout Australia. We have a program called Mousaferiadas Schools program, which is being delivered in Kampot, South Africa, India, Egypt and Brazil. And we have 400 students participating through that program on a weekly basis. And that's all about bringing back what was lost. In the case of Kampot, which is about 90 miles south of Phnom Penh, almost all the arts were completely wiped out. Every single artist, I think it was something like 90% of the artists were wiped out. Anyone who was an intellectual was wiped out. So what we're doing now is we're beginning to reinvigorate those classical traditions, and at the same time teach the kids traditions from other cultures through the arts.
Tough question for most people, but I suspect that you're going to have an answer. How do you measure your success? How do you know that you are achieving what you seek to achieve with Cultural Infusion?
I think the first way we are able to measure our success is the amount of anecdotal evidence that comes back to us. We have a survey that goes out. We have schools telling us that this is actually creating changes in the community. I recently had a mayor from a shire out in regional Australia who contacted me, and he said, your Aboriginal for a Day program that went into our community completely has transformed our whole community, because we had this perception of the Indigenous people, which was fueled by the media in Australia, and that has completely changed. We now have the greatest reverence and respect for one of the oldest living cultures in the world. So having this come back to us, and the fact that our programs continue to grow and there's demand for them all across the world, I think is evidence and testament that there's a need for our programs. I think one of the other biggest issues that we have in the world today is the cost of conflict, the cost of violence. Recently, the Economic Institute for Peace released a report which put the value of violence in the world at something like 11.3% of the world's GDP. And that's a huge figure. We're talking something like $9.8 trillion was spent.
You just mean the economic activity involved in waging violence?
Yeah. It was something like $9.8 trillion globally was spent on dealing with violence. the cost of violence. Now, what we also know is that the majority of that violence is also culturally based. Most of the violence in the world is cultural conflict. And when we talk about culture, we're talking about it as being, overarching and underpinning, and not only about shared meaning, but also as a set of behavioural values that a particular group might adopt, and how we can work with that to change that mindset and make it more open-minded.
Okay. I want to go back to sort of the tea conversation for a second, and take me through how you dealt with what, many of us who are entrepreneurs in this space, like yourself, how'd you deal with those sort of the dark early days of, I'm going to make this leap? You said you did several years of market research and testing the market, making sure you had something, but eventually you had to make the leap. And that's always the scariest moment. How'd you deal with those first, year or whatever it was until you really got your feet and, you sort of created a sustainable organization?
It's always difficult keeping an organisation sustainable. I think more so today than ever. Resources are running out. The not-for-profit sector is quite competitive. I suppose in the earlier days it was about doing all that market research, gathering those databases, going out there into the community, talking about the idea for those first 5 years. And simultaneously, I was, working still as a conductor, composer. I had an agency on the side which was promoting artists. And I suppose I needed to have the resources, the financial resources, the administrative resources in the beginning to sort of make that leap out into the wider community and say, well, I've formed this organisation called Cultural Infusion, which is about building intercultural understanding, working to improve cultural harmony and wellbeing in communities, in education, in youth. So I took that leap in the beginning, and what I noticed was because I'd done so much preparation, I segmented the marketplace out there. So it wasn't just about sort of understanding one market. It was looking at that whole market and going, how can I segment it into 50 segments? So when I develop all these different programs, I know how I can target them. So all that groundwork had happened. And, we had something like a 500% growth in the first 18 months of the organisation. If we got to about 2005, 2006, and all of a sudden, this is too much. We couldn't actually cope with that growth because we didn't actually have enough systems to support that growth. And we didn't have enough documents and procedures. And the organisation was sort of relying mainly on my knowledge to be able to drive everything forward. So when you have change of staff, all of a sudden, those staff would leave and you lost knowledge with that staff. So the next stage was to build up documents and procedures and also work at developing a management system, an automated management system, which would allow us to be able to cope with the amount of activity that was requested from us to deliver out there in the community. So we have our own software, and that makes the world of difference. If I had to do everything again, I probably would have gone off and studied coding, I think, because if you can code today and you have ideas, you can put both together and truly the world is your oyster. And I think this is the next phase of the organisation is we want to now take the systems that we have and then get them ready for a global marketplace and be able to take some of the very, very successful programs that we have. We initially started off becoming a provider of school workshops right across Australia, and that just grew from a few hundred a year to 3,000 a year. Mm-hmm. And so the next stage now is how can we develop the software to allow us to manage the complexities and taking something like that program throughout the world. But at the same time, we began to see that there was a need. People were asking for us. We want you to now engage with the community. We'd like you to start working with the Indigenous community or start developing workshops into the wider community. How could we start working with the youth, disengaged youth from different backgrounds, and start developing programs that would build understanding between the youth? And, the arts is a fantastic way of doing that. It's about engaging people. When you use the arts, you engage all the senses. Goes beyond the traditional academic way of learning. And I suppose this is another reason why the organisation has taken off. It's because schools are realising that kids need to be engaged. How do we keep those kids engaged? So an organisation like Cultural Infusion has been able to fill that void and, use the excitement of, all the cultural traditions out there and take them into a school community.
Tell me about a time when Cultural Infusion, either one of your programs or one of your initiatives or the organization itself in some way completely failed And you said, if you're not adaptable, that's sort of the skill for the future. But tell me about one of those times when you just sort of fell on your face and how you either helped your team or helped yourself to recover and get things back on track.
Okay. In 2009, sometimes when you're too adaptable and you cast the net out there too far, sometimes people can take an interest in your organisation, and then the expectations, what they want you to do is not actually what your main activity is. So we began to take on, projects which weren't really our strength, which wasn't really our core business. And by taking on those programs, the GFC came along and impacted on some of those major events that we were trying to produce. So the learning from that for me was stick to what we do best. We already do some really exciting things, and work at polishing it and making it better at what you do best. Don't take on things that are, beyond, the vision and the scope of the organisation. And I suppose that was an error on my judgment.
Classic piece of learning there, but I always like to hear, as they say, from the horse's mouth of, the realization of the net can be cast too wide. You've talked a lot about the hybrid nature of your organization, the hybrid, your belief in this fourth sort of business model. Give us an example of how you're putting that in place. Like very specifically, how are you using a for-profit initiative to fund nonprofit or vice versa, either through a product or through a service or something like that?
I think it's quite simple. It's about, those cross-sector partnerships. It's being able to share resources, share rent facilities. Like I mentioned earlier on, staff being able to span across two entities. As an individual, if I want to take a risk, I can take a risk. If I'm not able to access the public funds out there, then as an individual, I can maybe contribute to the not-for-profit activity and see if it might work or not. And more than often, the calculated risks, and most of the time it has worked for us. Sometimes it hasn't worked, but it's about being able to take those calculated risks and also not getting bogged down with a lot of the red tape that's required within a not-for-profit organisation. We find with a lot of the grant acquittals, there's so much red tape that when you're working within the profit sector, it's about get the job done, it's a quick acquittal, and move on to the next project. I think it's about being able to share those learnings and share those resources across the two entities in the end.
What does the next 5 years look like for Cultural Infusion and for yourself? Are you going to still be directing this organization? Are you going to move on? Or what do you have in store?
I'm not too sure if I'm going to move on in the next 5 years, but maybe the next 10 years. I'm only 47, so I think I've still got a lot to give to this organisation.
You've got another 20 years. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, but it might be in another area that I might move on. But yeah, I'd like to think I've got another 50 years too, Stephen. But what does it look like for us? We'd like to now see how we can begin to replicate and upscale our programs, across the world. Where we did the merger at the beginning of the year with Mayubuya, which was this youth organisation which was founded by Kamari Middleton, a really dynamic young Australian who's managed basically on the smell of an oil rag create this organisation with programs running in 5 countries. So we did this merger at the beginning of the year, and I think there's a lot of work to be done in consolidating the work that's been done in these 6 countries, and then seeing how we can maybe replicate these programs in different parts of the world. We would like to also see how we can maybe set up an endowment fund over the next few years. Because what Cultural Infusion has done is we've been able to go this far without any core funding. Now, if I look at the majority of our competitors out there, or nearly all of our competitors out there, they are all funded by the government in a major way. And we're saying, well, you know what, this is an alternative way of working, but a little bit of support could go a long way. So by setting up an endowment fund where we can find some maybe key stakeholders out there, where we say to them, look, loan us your money for 10 years. We might even give you some return at the end of those 10 years, but we can assure you we'll be able to build up so much internal administrative capacity which will allow us to begin to go out there and upscale and replicate our programs. If we're able on 10% public funds to create these $1 million programs, imagine what we will do with a $10 million endowment fund. So this is going to be our strategy, I think, over the next 1 to 3 years, is to set up that endowment fund, which will allow us to maybe start to move into this digital space. We've created some amazing digital products. Our Sound Infusion Web 2 based program, which allows people to discover cultures from all over the world by creating their own music online, has been recognised by the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations and the BMW World Group. We were a winner of the Intercultural Innovation Award back in 2013. And it's beginning to move into this digital space where we can actually have greater access to a worldwide market and begin to get people thinking about this space of there's another way to view the world. My worldview is not the only worldview. There are many worldviews out there. And how can I begin to, build up cultural competencies which are going to allow me to better navigate in this globalized world that we're living in?
How do you spend your day? As, the director of this organization, are your hands in projects? Are you out there just creating new ideas? Are you spending time, traveling around looking at how things are going on? How do you spend your day? Take us through a typical day for you.
My alarm usually goes off at 4:45 in the morning.
Wow.
I usually like to spend anywhere from about 30 minutes to an hour reading the world news. It's the first thing I do on my phone. Check a little bit of Facebook, a little bit of LinkedIn. Get to read what's happening across the world because, we're part of this global community. Then I usually get myself ready. I come to work. I'm still involved with some of the operations, but I'm having less and less to do with it. I function as the CEO/general manager. Ultimately, I'd like to just be the CEO where I'm going out there, speaking on behalf of the organisation and forming stakeholder relationships. Some days I've felt like a fireman, putting out fires. Mm-hmm. You've probably heard this from a lot of other CEOs. I mean that metaphorically, of course. Because when you're driving programs out there in the community, there's always things that sort of pop up. But there's less of that happening now, and there's a lot more strategic work happening and a lot more stakeholder relationship. And I've done the hard work to build up the core of the organisation. But in terms of forming new ideas, I'm very careful of new ideas, Stephen. Why? Because with every new idea, it's just not enough to dream up an idea. We can all come up with ideas. But do we have the systemic, the financial, and the administrative capacity to realise that idea? Most of us don't. So if I do form an idea, I think about a new idea or a new product. I think about how can it actually plug in to what we're already doing. Is it going to mean we're going to have to completely set up a new set of documents and procedures to make that idea work? So we think about it very, very carefully, and we're not about trying to stretch the organisation and take on the world. We're about working with what's actually working best at the moment and taking that idea to the global community so we can make the world a better place.
The last question that I have is one that I ask every guest here on the show. And you'll remember that most of the people who listen to this show are people who are interested in getting into the work that you do, or they did just come out of sort of a master's degree, or they are interested in transitioning from a different sector or a different line of work into the social space. What is your critical piece of advice that you would give to someone, in one of those positions about how to create sustainability and success in a career like this?
Don't be afraid of failure. What I've come to realise over the years is that from every time something hasn't worked, I've been able to take those learnings to work out how to take my next step in a safer way. I've also come to realise that I think the business community out there, the innovators out there that are working in the business world, in the profit world, could really be contributing to this space. Because I think primarily I was a businessman before. I was a person who, wanted to give back to the community. I wanted to give back to the community, but I was always thinking about the underlying financial model that was going to make, the idea work. And I think when business people are working, the innovators out there that are working, they're already working in an innovative way, which isn't in a textbook. And I'd like to see a lot more of those people enter this space. Not just people who want to give something back to the community, but every single business person out there that's been successful will find a creative way to create a sustainable social enterprise.
Now I have to follow up with a second question. Do you have an example of those people do you feel that migration is happening already? Do you have examples of people that you are starting to work with who either were business success or had the potential to be business success but made the choice to go social, so to speak?
On a personal level, no. But, we know of the work that Bill Gates is now doing with his foundation, and Warren Buffett, and, a lot of the billionaires out there in the community that have already been successful. But I'd like to see those people who are starting off at base one go, you know what, I can actually create a social enterprise which is generating, income, but it's also generating human capacity at the same time simultaneously. And I think that almost every single business person that goes out there, whether it be a micro business or a huge multinational company, they should all be thinking, how is what I'm doing giving back to the community? Is it taking away, or is it giving in a positive way? And where it is taking away, how can then I discard that? Or how can I find a way to, turn it around so it's creating positive social impact? And I think they're the questions that every single business person could be asking, because a lot of these business people are highly innovative. I see it again and again out there in the community, but they don't want to make that transition. They're too scared. Why should I give back? No, you have a duty to give back because you already have the capacity to think in an innovative way. So take the step forward. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with you creating a profit, but how can you take part of that profit that's going to benefit the wider community out there? And I think that's the only way we're going to be, as a global community, we're going to be able to build up, create a sustainable space that every future citizen can live in.
Peter, this has been such a delightful conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you for your interest in our organisation.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from 8preneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.